Hello, it's Deacon Ed again. I was kind of hoping I would have to get to this point on bringing about presentations, but between my wife and I, we agree that because of the world and the things that are going on around us, it's important for me to present what I can and not to do it so much to cause people to create greater fear, but more so to keep them informed so they're not fearful, to remind them that God's in charge and things are what they should be. It's come to my attention, as has many different things, that for the most part, there is a new horizon of issues that are going to create more problems than we've already seen. And I don't usually write the bishop for those things that come. Normally, I just let them flow to give them more time to come to the surface. Then maybe there's more answers than there are questions, which is absolutely great. Questions are good, but sometimes those questions get lost in the process. I wrote to Bishop and I said, I'm providing specific information about a medical advancement that carries grave consequences. Like many of the areas of concern within my ministry of bioethics, I often cross paths with humanity's misguided science. But on those occasions, I have not addressed them, as I will often allow certain issues to be settled at the end of discovery by the Holy See. And then, of course, they do their presentations. But in this case, it is one of several issues that are currently in existence. But this particular one carries the most grievous consequences that I can see when it comes to the medical procedures that we're getting into. Something I thought was going to happen down the road. I know I've spoken to my peers and other people that I've spoken to in groups and explained these things, but most of the time those things have been down the road. Just for the same reason, I automatically try to give both positive and negative, but this particular action carries many, many different issues that are not even being discussed, and they're being pushed off to the side. The Jerusalem Post stated a few days ago, I had the heads up that something had changed about what they were dealing with. And what I'm referring to is the engineering and synthetic embryo they had just put together. Now, up until now, it's all been down the road. It's all been a matter of maybe. So here's what they posted. Without needing human sperm to impregnate human eggs to create embryos, researchers at Weizmann Institute of Science in Reelveld have created complete models of human embryos from stem cells cultured in the lab and managed to grow them without a womb up to 14 days. The team built on their recent achievement of creating synthetic stem cells based on models of mouse embryos. The team said their breakthrough could open new avenues of research into the infertility, early pregnancy failures, birth defects, drug testing, and growth of tissue for transplant, as well as help scientists peer into the dramatic first weeks of an embryonic development. You see, this is the article that I was concerned about as I go on in the conversation to the bishop. Last year, on August the 7th, 2022, Israel mentioned the scientists created the world's first synthetic embryo using just stem cells. It got my attention, and then I looked into it further. And let me continue. Professor Jacob Hannes lab is the first to create a mouse embryo, and also develop special growth conditions for human stem cells. Okay. Will his method lead to culturing tissues for human transplants? Again, there's so many things going on here. So as I read further, you'll begin to understand where my concerns are and why I wrote the bishop immediately. This is something that cannot be put off. Again, within the parameters of this article on the 7th of August, 2022, there is what is known in the field as a weighted trial balloon. And even though the words appear to be speculative in this article, suggesting it might happen, they carry the weight of truth presented in this format to preempt the raising of eyebrows by the general population as to the next step, which was projected to be one that would be challenged because of its moral perpetuity. Doing this is not within the bounds of bioethics. I'm sorry, but there was question about following through on this, because when you're creating these kind of things, you're going outside of what evolution has created. And when you do that, there are always anomalies that show up. It doesn't matter what we do or how science says this is working. I promise you, if they do something out of the legacy of what's available, there has to be an adjustment in everything. The overall attention, I'll continue, the overall attention to such developments in themselves do not carry the weight of concern with most individuals as at the onset, because the initial article and the actual developments are speaking about work being completed on animal research. This is a science tactic to avoid ethical oversight. As long as they remained in that term animal, they were okay. The weight that is mentioned now is brought to bear over the heads of those who would reject such development in the second part of the advancement in bioengineering. Okay, so they floated a balloon with that information intentionally last year. It wasn't just, hey, we're talking. The last part that suggests, will his methods lead to culturing tissues for, they locked it down, human transplant. Everybody's going, oh, that's a good thing. Yeah, it sounds great, but there's always more to it. And what we want to look at, and I'll continue, once the general population is made aware of the first part, then those who write science and medical magazines will engage in open conversation about these advancements and play off the words that are intended to soften the blow of the second part of such procedures because of their prejudice to new scientific development and discoveries, not the moral path that would set confinement to development of such medical creations. Okay, you got to stop and think. What they've done is they've included the general population, that's everybody. So even those people who are kind of on the outsets of science, or somebody in bioethics is saying, oh, there's a good process in this. But they set those words out and left it in the animal world a year ago, and then turned around and did the next step. And then I'll get to the word that changes all of that in a second. But I want you to know that's what's going on. So the general population now backs this because it sounds great. And then the other, as it were, shoe drops. The International Bioethics Committee, who might determine, which I doubt they will, because they usually go along with not everything, but most things, to respond counter to this next step, as it would be the case for such entities such as the Catholic Church and other entities, would be seen as an inconsequential statement, as those engaged in these activities will use diversified terminology designed specifically to also delineate any challenge to such matters in this response. Okay, so what were the words? Words like complete models of human embryos. They're declaring this embryo to be a model, not a real living possible creature. And in doing so, what they've done is they've removed the stigma of human embryo. Complete in this process is also a very important thing, because that key word makes sure that we're not presuming this thing is a monster, a creation. Then the second word, model, removing the tendency to feel guilty about it being connected to a real living thing, specifically a human embryo. This same group now has the support of the general population to override their creation of the creation of their Frankenstein. This is mainly because the Catholic Church and other such entities carry a stigma, a false stigma, of entering such scientific matters without being fully informed, let alone being known as the passive group, also known as the better late than never group. So a lot of times the Catholic Church, again, they wait for a while, they look at what's going on, they do studies on it, and I understand that process. But sometimes it's obvious. You know, if I take a baseball bat and I whack somebody upside the head, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that I intended to injure that person. In other cases, what they would do was say, well, he was swinging the bat and you didn't see where he was swinging it and he hit somebody. That would be the backside of that. The front side of this is the Catholic Church is always seen as a group of people that will remain in conservation on everything, because they don't immediately speak up when it's necessary. This is necessary. This is not a dive in deep, figure out the medical terminology, determine what's going on and say, well, maybe there's more to this. And again, remember, at the onset, they wrapped it in certain words, and I'll continue. In some situations, there are those who would write counterproductive information because these individuals claim to be Catholic, but really rarely live in the culture of our faith. So you have people, I'll mention President Biden as a perfect example, declaring he's Catholic while not operating under the premise of his faith. You can't say you're Catholic and be Catholic and believe in abortion. I'm sorry. It is not an acceptable practice of a true Catholic believer. You can punch it, you can move it, you can stab it, you can do whatever you want, but it still remains as truth. Now, here's where I'm going to pull it through so that this ties the knot for that specific concept. For example, abortion. Abortion is considered to be the wrong thing. If you want to know why I know this beyond the shadow of a doubt, let's talk about what happens. You remove the possibility of another human being at the expense of convenience. Now, you say to me, convenient. It's not convenient for a woman to have a child. No, it's not. But whether the child is accepted or not, it's still not convenient. I don't know of any woman who jumps up and down during the birthing process at the hospital and says, yay, I'm in pain. But you also have to remember that every woman manages not only to get through that process, but in the end, 9 times out of 10, they are more than willing to have another child. Which says what about the whole experience? It's unique. If those children are aborted, then how are you going to respond at the gates of heaven when they're sitting on the other side of the gate? Those children, it's not that they will condemn you. It's not that maybe even God, Mary, or Jesus will condemn you. But you have to refute yourself, because you're going to look at this and go, what did I do? And in that moment, how will you get past it? I don't know. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But daggum, it's obvious where this lies. It doesn't sit on the fence. This thing about rape and incest and whatever else, and you go on and on about all the issues that you put before abortion, and why does it come up blank? The reality is, when this first started, children weren't born outside of the womb. They couldn't survive. And yet, here science and all of its efforts to condemn to exemplify abortion are trying to create more living things. That doesn't make any sense to me. So let's keep it clear. Let's make sure we're not compromising the obvious. The same with this particular unit. These people are developing people, embryos. They're not identifying it as important. And whatever they're creating, what are the ultimate issues of doing something like this? They're not following any protocol. They're not within the guidelines of even the international bioethics. You can point it out to me, but I'm going to remind you again. This is not an acceptable practice as of yet. The trial balloon was floated when China opened up the gate and said, we created 2 genetically engineered children. That, the world shut that down. They were mad at China. They sent letters. Every bioethicist in the whole United States, I got so many emails from so many different science and ethical directors and whatever else. I was inundated. And I said, of course, I agree with you. The reasonable response, of course, was China did the right thing, according to them. They wrote that they had arrested an individual within the group that was there when all this came about. What you don't know, 2 years later it came out that the person they arrested was actually the man who was the whistleblower. Doesn't fit. So how will this lead to the dark side? Because they mentioned all these good things. They have scattered the field within such matters as research into infertility. It's going to help this. It's going to help early pregnancy failure. It's going to help birth defects. It's going to help drug testing. It's going to help growth of tissues for transplant, as well as help scientists peer into the traumatic first weeks of embryonic development. Sounds all good. But the reality is all very noble causes, and humanity will always take it to the next level, especially as it gets closer to one of the major things, gifts from God. They are going to tear it apart and make it sound noble, but move it on to other things, withholding any explanation of possible ramifications of such actions, not only in its outcomes, but what are the guidelines that has created this process? What was used in that process? Is there anything more to be heard of? Is it truly what they're saying, or is it just they're saying it to gain that financial recognition? And if they are, and they're lying about how they got to this point, even more so this is an issue because science is currently doing that to gain financial resources for grant money and other things without following scientific protocol, which is required by most countries under given conditions, but rarely are they listed, these wrong directional issues that will arise from such things, and these important factors, not to mention those unintended issues that result from incomplete such processes. What I'm going to refer to is when you create these things, you may end up creating a disease. You may end up creating a defective person. You may end up creating less than what you had intended. And that's why we shouldn't be playing with this. It's amazing how we will go around shouting and screaming about animal experimentation, and we're not willing to put humans in front. Yeah, exactly. One simple example from my perspective would be those individuals who are seriously misguided. We call them gender confused individuals who would see this in an opportunity to have a child without including the opposite sex. You may not be aware, but they've already created wombs that are not attached to any living thing other than the mechanical function. So now we have people that are jumping up and down, screaming about themselves to get mostly attention. Kids don't need to be brought into that process. And you and I both know, and many people are starting to push back, that this direction of transgender for kids is repulsive and unacceptable. Kids need attention. They need direction. They do not need somebody telling them that they are not who they biologically are. And it also brings about guilt. If they're not being true to themselves in real time, not imaginary adults who wish to bring them across the table and dragging and screaming, then how can they understand themselves from a true perspective? If you turn around and tell a child they can come to school and then tell the teacher that they are such and such and not tell their parents, they're withholding. It's called a lie. And any decent psychology, any intelligent psychologist would tell you, anytime you tell a falsehood, it carries a process built into the DNA of human anatomy. It's called guilt. It exists. And on both sides of the fence, both in theology / religion, that God put it there, and or self-directed human beings that were created from some kind of accident in space, still carries the stigma of guilt. You kill somebody, you know it's wrong. And I'm sorry if anybody says otherwise. I can show you over and over again how that fits into a truth, not an imaginary subject. So if you turn around and you're carrying a guilt of this lie, then you turn around and you include teachers and administration. You're telling them they have to lie. You want to know why schools are lost? Well, I don't know. If I was a teacher and I had to do that, I'd be depressed. And guess what? I was a teacher up until a year ago, and I did never would I have done that. Oh yeah, I would have dumped my job, but then I would have gone after them in reality and expressed exactly to what I'm talking about. Florida has a law. Says you cannot hide things. School board can't sit on the side and do these kind of things. And yet, what? They are. So why are we doing this? And why would we create something when we're turning around saying to the average person from outside of the faith, by the way, abortion is fine. It's okay. Let them decide. It's their decision. Yes, it is. But why would you just keep your mouth shut when God tells you to speak up? The action of an abortion is wrong. It is wrong. It's against God. There's no ambiguity. The most egregious of all these things could be the consequences from such development would include, like I said earlier, diseases that we hadn't thought of, let alone the issue that would occur from using these new developments, which is even overlooked when you respond to these issues of such things. Think of in vitro fertilization. I just want you to think for a second. In vitro fertilization was brought to the table and said, we're going to help people that can't get pregnant. I was 33 years old, and I was all about changing the world when it came to abortion. We had the ultimate experience of going to Tallahassee to speak to Congress and whatever else. Dr. Lejeune, who was the discoverer of Down syndrome, showed up, and he gave us a talk. One of the part of the talks was in vitro fertilization. What he told us made perfect sense. When you cannot check the sperm for its strength in its existence, as it would be in a natural process, then you create anomalies. Often he showed us how the numbers would come down based on what he showed us of those sperm cells who had to fight, not just to get upstream, but also to actually impregnate the egg. Those things that would require that sperm to be more than just some oddball sperm, that sounds weird, but an unhealthy sperm fertilizing the egg, creating a bad situation. He said in third and fourth generations, he could guarantee that there would be physical, medical, and sometimes psychological issues. He showed us the numbers. And what he did was a simple trickle-down effect of where small anomalies exist and how they continue. I can tell you right now, if you circumvent the process, which we do in dogs, and we decide to create these perfect animals, by our perspective, what happens to the species? They get a little crazy. They end up having issues. Medically, they don't live as long as other dogs do. There's so many things involved here. You cannot always foresee the downside of something because there are so many possibilities that even in the extravagance of having computers, often we don't understand the ramifications. So here we are with in vitro fertilization. We, as a general society, not only accepted it, we embraced it. And there was a study done at Harvard under the situation that really shocked me because they were researching Not just looking at something like in vitro fertilization, because that didn't come up at first. What came up was there were individuals within both those colleges, such as Harvard, Notre Dame, I believe also, I'm not sure the other third one, Harvard, Notre Dame, that there were people that were going through a state of depression, and they were asking questions that aligned eventually to the question, who were your parents? Well, guess what showed up? The people that were created from in vitro fertilization, put together, ended up being the number one group of people that were having depression because they wanted to know who their parents were, their mother, I'm sorry, their father, who was dad, where did that come from? And who, in some cases, if you did a shared pregnancy and whatever else, where you take the egg and move it to the woman, who's mom? That's not my real mom, even though I was born through this process. They were questioning who brought them into this world. And that conversation got a little more complex because it wrapped itself in initially into adoption and other things, which was easily moved forward with. Only if the person was able to find their real father or whatever. Adoption. Who was my mom? Who was my dad? There's an internal need for the connection. Even if it's superfluous because of other people dynamically talking about their parents, it's still there. So that creates a problem that we thought would be not an issue, and yet here we are. The consequences of such actions create further dimensions that we cannot see. People need to pay attention to these things. They're important. God doesn't just put everything together and say, okay, do whatever you want. He creates laws because they have to be in place in order for the things that go forward can and do go forward. They do, and they function right in front of us. You trim a tree. Why? Because you want it to get thicker. You want it to develop even more so. Where does fruit come into play? Fruit turns around, it creates seeds. I've got a rose bush. I trim the rose bush, it gets thicker. But if I hybrid two rose bushes together and I want to have another one develop, I can clip a piece of the rose bush and restart its roots. But I don't really get the strength that I get if I can take something from, say, for example, an orange, a seed. If I get the seed from the orange, the growth of that orange works. If I hybrid too many times, the seeds don't come forth like they would in an heirloom seed. If I hybrid a dog or an animal of sorts, the bloodline thins out. Things happen. They're not as strong. Even though you put two things together, the health issues start to arise in almost every case, in one form or another. So, I'll say this again. This is one of many issues that are arising. The subject of synthetic embryo is scary. It's not going to be put off to the side by calling it a model. What a ridiculous concept. If you understand why they did that, then there's something being hidden. Either because they don't want to go through the real rigor process of investigation. Apply it to this. 90% of science is discovery through failure. You're working in one direction, something comes up, you change the process because you saw this, whatever that is. And then you said, wait a second, this may not be true, hypothesis, but that is true because that is not true. Therefore, the answer is next. It's next. It's next till you get the right answer. When you don't follow those procedures, then you're not taking into account the purity of the question. The question being, what is it you're trying to find out? And we don't make these things. We discover these things. When we start pretending to be God, then we fail. I'm guaranteed every time. So I end my talk saying that there's going to be more. I'm going to start bringing up anytime I see something like this, synthetic embryo, I'm going to start bringing it about and bringing it to the table. Don't get me wrong. There are many bioengineering things that are about to arrive that are amazing. They will provide us with unique and very important changes in our world. But at the same time, we don't need anybody to light that bomb up. The atomic weapon doesn't need to come into fruition as far as a weapon is concerned. Let's stick with the power plants. Let's make it happen at the other end, especially when you're talking about human life. Because it looks like if mankind keeps playing around and changing what should be into what they believe it could be, then in the end, because they're the ones saying this is what it could be, it has to fail because humans always fail. It's one of those things about being human. Thank you for your time.